Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we contemplate the true human, how we can consciously reinvent ourselves at the end of the world. A very appropriate thing to consider given current world conditions. As we begin our program today, I want to continue my reflections on Gaza. We continue to look day by day at what's happening there because I believe that what's taking place in Gaza is of a trans-historical importance. That if the world allows Israel to completely destroy Gaza, something indelible, something irretrievable will be done. And I say this in the spirit of the president of Rwanda, who commented on the 30th anniversary of the genocide there between the Hutus and the Tutsis 30 years ago, in which he said, as I mentioned yesterday, but it's worth repeating today, the reason why it happened is because the world, the United Nations, the great powers, did nothing. And this came to me with renewed force today when I looked at a podcast by Gideon Levy, a very well-known Israeli journalist who is one of the few people in all of Israel that has been speaking out as forcefully as I have, as many people have external to Israel, but he's inside Israel and he's been speaking out under great duress. And he made the comment that there's no meaningful opposition to what the Netanyahu government is doing. And in fact, he said that the situation is so bad that it's the internal pressure from the settlers, from the ultra-right wing, that is compelling the Netanyahu government to engage in the mass murder that we've seen 24/7 for the last 6 months. He pointed out that in contrast to the June 6th war that was literally over in a week, the war on Gaza is the longest war that Israel has ever fought. And the damage that it's been doing to the Palestinians is only equaled by the damage that Netanyahu is doing to Israel and to the feelings of people all around the world about Judaism and world Jewry. It's an extraordinary moment. And then he made the same comment. The only way this is going to be solved is if somebody external to Israel does what we did not do with Rwanda, and that is step in. And there's only one person in the whole world that can do that. And that's President Joe Biden and the United States of America. And it's within this context that I want to make a few remarks briefly, but I think importantly for our ongoing consideration. Gideon Levy made a comment about the call between Biden and Netanyahu, which, according to Biden, was a come to Jesus call, as he said in an open mic that he didn't know was recording. But to Gideon Levy, There was no coming to Jesus. There was only a very obsequious plea that some humanitarian relief be allowed in, because on the very same day of the call, the White House approved more weapons, more bombs, more artillery, more tanks. So according to Gideon Levy, the president has not done what he needs to do and should do. It's very synchronistic that yesterday in the UN Security Council, a motion was surfaced to grant Palestine full membership in the United Nations. Every time it's come up before, the US has vetoed it. And so far, there's no word, at least that I know of, as we start our session today, of any indication of how the US is going to vote. I mentioned yesterday that the two-state solution that is before the UN has been superseded by the genocide. So for all practical and I would say moral purposes, a two-state solution is not possible. And therefore, the only thing that really can and should be done, both practically and morally, is a single state, which is what most countries around the world have. A single state where different religions, different ethnicities, different ideologies, different professions, people all live together in a democratic or even an authoritarian process. But it's generally understood that in the world that we live in today, racism and exclusivity of one race over another is no longer tenable, no longer defensible, because it ends up exactly with what's happening in Gaza. If you believe that you're chosen, if you believe that you're special, if you believe that God has given you extraordinary status and to nobody else, that leads to apartheid. That leads to genocide. So what we're seeing in Gaza is the logical conclusion of 75 years of settler colonialism as Jews from Europe came into Palestine in a way that was exclusive and subordinating and dominating to the local population. And the world now, as President or Prime Minister Netanyahu announced yesterday, the date is now set for the final assault on Rafah. The UN is considering recognizing the Palestinian people. Turkey today stopped exporting to Israel. The International Court of Justice is discerning whether Germany also, along with the United States, is contributing to genocide. And in the maelstrom of all these forces, one man who will make a decision as to whether this should be allowed to happen or not. And that is Joe Biden, President of the United States. I'm writing him a letter, which I hope to send today, begging him to do the one thing that if he would do it, the Gordian knot in the Middle East would be cut through. And that is order an immediate ceasefire of all parties, not only in Israel and Hamas and Palestine, but Israel and Hezbollah, Israel and the Houthis, and Israel and Iran, a regional ceasefire, stating categorically that the United States was immediately ceasing any future further weapons shipments to any party in the Middle East, and calling for a summit of all parties in Jerusalem to begin the process of negotiating toward a single state. Very importantly, there's about 7.5 million Jews and 7.5 million Palestinians. If you combine all of Israel and Palestine together, the simplest solution available is to bring it all together as one. That's how the European Union was created in the aftermath of the Second World War. That's how South Africa went from apartheid to a single democratic state. It's just a matter of somebody stating the obvious with the power to make it happen. And that's the president, Joe Biden. So I would ask all of you, all of us, to think about how can we get this word to the president? Because now that the date is set for the final assault on Rafah, there's a limited window within which redemption, resurrection can take place. And whether we do what needs to be done or not will be as much determined by forces and capacities outside the White House, making the will of the people known, as what happens inside the White House. But we all need to be clear, it's the White House that will make the final decision about the final assault on Rafah. So thank you for bearing witness with me on this extraordinary moment in history. This is why the subject that we're going to be taking up today is so important. I've said before that if we allow genocide live on TV, we're as guilty as the Israelis. And if we do that, we forfeit the right to call ourselves civilized. So what does the true human mean in a time of climate change? A time of turbulence at every level throughout society. In a time of genocide, what is the true human? How do we reinvent ourselves at the end of our world? That may be one of the most important and profound questions that we can ask ourselves. So I'd like to invite an old friend of mine, Samantha Sweetwater, who I've known for many years. She's a dancer, she's a teacher, she's a clairvoyant, she's a mentor. She took her master's degree in wisdom studies at Ubiquity University in our wisdom school. She has taught and learned worldwide from indigenous people and from mentors of all kinds. And she's now preparing a book by the title of True Human. So Samantha, I welcome you to Humanity Rising. And Samantha's going to take a few minutes just to present whatever it is that she would like us to know about her book. And then I'll circle back and we will have a dialogue for the balance of the time. But thank you, Samantha. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's so good to be here, Jim. And it's I'd like to weave the narrative of True Human, or offer that True Human as a context for everything you've just said, that is so profoundly immanent in the bundle of our moral competency as a race, really. And thank you for framing that as you do, so clearly and so unambiguously. I too will be writing a letter, and I encourage everyone here to do the same. So True Human as a frame came from a dream. In April of 2020, I had a dream where I was walking on another planet, a Gaian planet, very similar to our own, with a being named Sophia. And we walked along a seawall with trees fairly similar to Norfolk pines towards a gathering storm. And we walked all the way out to the end of a point. And at the end of the point, we became silent, and with our hearts and our minds and the attunement of our bodies, we greeted the storm and we communed with it in all the energy that it was bringing to the land and the water, the rain. But the fullness of its energy meeting us is the fullness of who we are. And then we bowed and thanked the storm and walked back in the village. And she said to me in her mind, the civilizing impulse of true humans is to harmonize the forces of nature. And I woke up from that dream quite literally tasked with a collection of questions that I knew I needed to answer. What is true to being human? What is civilizing? What does that have to do with the forces of nature? And this really important omission in that sentence, that she doesn't say to harmonize with, she says to harmonize. And the more I've sat with that statement, I realized that we are a force of nature, and one of our greatest tasks is to harmonize us in relationship to the rest of the Gaian creation. True Human is a book that was born with me. I think I was born as I imagine a lot of people are these days, with a deep sense for the existential moment that we are in right now, a sense that I was born in the Cold War, so I was born with a deep sense of a deep awareness with the fact that with a press of a button, we could annihilate the planet. I was also raised by environmentalists, by the early wave of environmentalists coming out of Rachel Carson's early work, who were also aware that ecologically we were degrading the planet far faster than we were repairing things. So in a sense, this book was born with me, and it has been built by multiple iterations of my life as an embodiment expert and artist and systems change expert and permaculturalist. And slowly, I've been gathering together a picture of this idea that we have to know ourselves in a different way if we want to stop breaking the world. So True Human takes us on a journey that invites you to recognize how infinitely precious this planet is. this planet that we're a part of, and to slowly unwind all the aspects of modernity that have that taught us to put ourselves at the top of a pyramid, and to put ourselves back into the circle of life where we are a part of everything that is happening around us, where we are in communion with the reality of life lifing us, and to reimagine who we get to be as co-creators of a world that sings in alignment with the song of life. The book takes you through a journey from modernity through a plant medicine experience that I had with iboga, where the medicine took me to the vantage point of a universe creating itself, booting itself up from the void, and then falling back into nothing, dying a graceful death, and then showing me a planet booting up complex life in all of its exquisite complexity and dying a beautiful natural death. And then comparing that roughly to a human booting themselves up from nothing into a mature, beautiful adult human being, and then slowly aging and dying a natural death. And the medicine said to me, "What is the saddest sound in a universe?" The sound of a complex, life-bearing planet dying before it has reached its evolutionary potential. That is exactly where we are right now. We're at this a critical nexus where we as humans who are tasked to harmonize the forces of nature are about to cause the saddest sound in the universe, the sound of a complex, life-bearing planet dying before it has reached its evolutionary potential. Take that in for a moment. What is the saddest sound in a universe? The sound of a complex, life-bearing planet dying before it has reached its evolutionary potential. So our planet has a next level of evolutionary potential that we, as creator, preserver, destroyers, have an opportunity to co-create. This is the deeper meaning of the Anthropocene, according to all the teachings that I have received, is that it's an initiatory gateway, a rite of passage for us as a species to recognize what we are. We are the creator, preserver, destroyer beings, like the Hindu trinity of Vishnu, Shiva, Brahma, Shiva. We have the power to create, preserve, and destroy. But what we've gotten wrong in the way we have constructed humanity is that we've made complex systems that function destructively within the larger ecology we're a part of. And we're sitting at this nexus where if we don't recognize the destructive nature of how we've been doing creativity, our creativity will subsume the macroorganism we're a part of. We are a cancer behaving in a way that is completely unmoored from the logic of the larger body that makes us possible. So the great initiation of this time is entirely bound up with restraint and preservation. Can we restrain and organize our creativity in ways that are preserving of the larger planetary body we're a part of, preserving of and elevating of the song of life, the soul of life, the soul and integrity of each human and all beings who co-construct our lives here on this planet. Ultimately, we have to reimagine ourselves in context. We have to link our imagination to what I call the bionoetic intelligence of life, the mind and the song, the mind and the poetry, and the body of biology. Somehow this is very deeply related to what we're navigating right now in current events, which has everything to do with how do we create new and yet shockingly ancient and obvious ways of engaging in our shared humanity, in limiting our capacity for violence and destruction, and tending the possibility that everyone could come home together, the audacious possibility that we could heal the unhealable and create a world where everyone comes home. So this is my first opportunity to present to people what this book is about in a large scale way. The book is coming out in October. And it's working me at a level more deeply than anything ever has, to stand in what I feel is a radical, audacious, and deeply practical stance of commitment to organize our humanity according to the well-being of life. Thanks for letting me present this. I'm very grateful to be here.
Thank you, Samantha. Thank you so much. I really find myself being moved by your notion of what's the saddest sound in the universe. I'd never thought about that before. But I think you're right. It's when a complex system that knows better is just deliberately and without restraint taking itself out of the miracle of life.
Yeah.
And, I was thinking about, just saw in the news today that the month of March was, I think, the 10th or the 11th consecutive hottest month in the history of the world, and with no end in sight. And here I am in Washington. Nobody even talks about it. There's no press. There's just a little snatch of news, and then it disappears in the tumult. And that's the saddest sound. There's not even a whimper.
That's right. And then if you think about that, so I'm so grateful to you for giving me this opportunity to present about this book. It feels almost premature, and I'm so grateful because there's such a bundle. Like, my life has been organized by trying to hear the alternative narratives that might align with a deep sense of instinctive knowing. So one of the foundational invitations with True Human is that our bodies know that we're part of this song. And there's an aspect of recovering from Enlightenment rationality and recovering from the arc of civilization, but also recovering from the Cartesian, I think, therefore I am, that is a colonizing frame of human minds over matter, that is a recovering of what our bodies actually know, which is that we are part of this larger song, and we are innate, we can attune to it, we can entrain with it, that's foundational to our health and our well-being and our sanity. Like, we will never solve the mental health crisis unless we actually start to get that we are bodies inside a larger body that made us to be able to hear and taste and touch and feel and play and sing it, which is what the Kogi are trying to tell us. I know you've spoken quite a lot on this channel about what the Kogi are saying. And in some ways, I feel like my life has been both, I've studied with a lot of these indigenous teachings, but I've also worked really hard to unearth their intelligence in myself.
Mm.
Um, and I think I was doing that long before I had indigenous teachers. And so there's a way that the book is about the self-authentication of neo-indigeneity and the ground in us that is biological and instinctive, that can actually remember, it can awaken, but not in the transcendent sense. It can awaken in the immanent sense to the screaming of the world around us, that would have us be responsive to the oceans, to our animal brethren, to the Palestinian right on the other side of the wall, to the insanity of the hatred that is moving through the Israeli army, through Netanyahu, that is a shocking level of sociopathy and hatred. And that it would hit us with the appropriate shock from a biological, what I call biospiritual, that includes very deeply the psycho-emotional intelligence of the emotional body as an organismic body that is meant to be responsive to life. But this does require some deprogramming of a lot of what, like, both modernity and even Eastern spirituality, which is, I frame that as a necessary but not sufficient toolbox. Like the mastery of mind and of the liberatory capacity of transcendent consciousness, or yoking awareness to itself, depending on what lineage you're speaking from, is necessary, but not sufficient in any way, shape, or form, because it fails to entrain empathy and embodiment and co-creation and collaboration and this like deep communion that is a witness that the Kogi are tending all the time. The Kogi, with all of their instruments and with their practices of weaving, are tending the betweenness. They're tending the withness that humans are made for in this creation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the space between things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that requires recognizing an other. Like in the classic kind of Mahamudra frame, the first thing you do is you collapse everything into awareness, into emptiness. And in a neo-indigenous frame, you would say, actually, that's wrong practice. Because what we want to do is become exquisitely attuned to the uniqueness of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's also true.
Yeah. So this
Now,
is what I've been writing about.
speak more about bionoetics.
Mm, mm. It's interesting. I was meditating on noesis this morning before our call. The word noetics, it refers to mind, and but it's interesting to reach back into the intelligence of the original Greek and Latin, which was actually a very embodied intelligence. So and thinking historically about etymology and the interpretive frames that we use, like, my sense with the word noesis is it is mind in the embodied sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So bionoetic is, according, you could say it's according to the mind, body, and soul of biology. You could go a layer under that with an insight, like one of the tendencies in reductionist science, and like I live in Silicon Valley, so the tendency in a world that's trying to figure out cognition and how that relates to intelligence and consciousness and what that relates to AI. I'm in that world. What we fail to understand a lot of times is that mind is a function of it, excuse me, that biology is an emergent property of physics. You can't break it all down into physics. This is Stuart Kaufman's fundamental insight with reimagining the sacred, is that there's emergent properties that occur from physics to chemistry to biology to ecology to culture.
Mm, mm, mm.
And that all of these, he builds in a lot of ways off of Teilhard de Chardin's understanding of the universe as a creative urge, of life as a creative urge that is not separate from God, that is awe-inspiringly bound, woven, a plenum of the divine. And that there are emergent properties at each level of evolutionary process that cannot be reduced to the level beneath them. And from that insight, you start to think about, well, what is a human? A human is an organism that's nested inside an organismic process that made us.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
We're healthy in relationship to that greater organismic process that made us. If we don't organize culture to then additionally, we are cultural beings, and culture is hyperplastic. Hyperplastic. It's like the most plastic evolutionary layer. And we're neotenous, so we are born, we have a very long developmental cycle. We can train ourselves in all kinds of different ways. We don't get the insight that if we don't align culture with the biological substrate that is where our health and our psychological well-being lies, we will never be healthy, happy, sane beings, ever, because we can't not be organisms. It's a really interesting way of looking at everything, at design, at culture, at education, at developmental processes. And when you look from that lens, and then start to observe indigenous teachings and indigenous ways of living, they suddenly make this higher design sense, like civilization design sense, in a way that is so exquisite and kind of mind-blowing because of how powerfully we've managed to project the myth of primitivism onto indigenous cultures. And suddenly you see that there's this kind of exquisite tapestry that's not the same in all indigenous cultures, of cultural mechanisms to organize the human in integrity with ecology.
Yeah. Well, I've been studying the Maya, and what you're saying is exactly the power of the Maya. They start with physics. They start with mathematics and geometry, and all their seers spend their whole lives contemplating the natural law, the natural way that the universe creates itself. And then culture, religion, shamanism, spirituality then becomes the pathways by which humans can more and more deeply align themselves with the natural order of things.
Mm-hmm.
And it's such a powerful illumination, because the Western mind comes at it from the completely opposite end of things.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And this pathway back, and then we, like you just said, we further barricade ourselves from the truth by designating the deepest wisdom as primitive.
Right. Right.
And then we're done. And we're completely disconnected, disembodied, mentally naked and sterile.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we're making so many destructive decisions and engage in so many destructive practices. So let's pursue that for a moment. I'd love to have you talk about the true human and the end of the world. I mean, how did we get that disconnected, and
Mm.
what's the pathway back?
Mm.
I know that's a big question.
There's
So
there's a lot of, it's interesting. So we can look at how did we get this disconnected on one level? And I think this is a really like this is the first and important, and it's an important framing, is that we couldn't help it. That there's a cycle of adolescence that an organism such as ourselves goes through, where we kind of get the subjective and the objective. We pull ourselves away from the mother, and we generate separation from the ecologies we occupy. And I don't know that this is totally necessary, but it is an interesting lens of like, we've simply gone through an adolescence where we needed to differentiate and self-define. And you could look at the arc of Western intellectual history as a process of self-definition, and saying like, I think, therefore I am, or I'm a human and God's out there. These are all experiments in pulling the world apart, pulling the wholeness apart.
Mhm.
And that it may be that this whole arc is in some ways a necessary arc of maturation. That's one frame.
Yeah, that's the
Yeah,
most benign frame.
it's the benign frame.
Yeah, but I mean, it's useful. Anybody has kids knows that kids will naturally separate themselves.
Yes,
It's just a natural function of growth, because you've got
yes,
to go from within the womb to outside the womb, but still dependent on the mother, to being independent of the mother. And that's not always an easy process. And once
right,
the disconnect has happened, what you discover, it's not so easy to find your way back.
right,
That's part of that paradox. You fight your
right.
way out, and then once you're out, getting back in is a very complex challenge requiring utmost maturity.
Yes. Yes, and it's interesting because it's like the only way that that happens is from an internal humbling, like a submission to the fact of the intimacy.
Mm.
Like like the process of an adult child healing with their parents has so much to do with a sort of sublimation of self and a softening and an ability to show up humbly in a way that has never happened before for that person or for
Mhm.
those people. And we're right in that phase with
Mhm.
Gaza. We're
Yeah.
right, like it's exactly that kind of like, could there be that much humility and maturity for these particular parties to sublimate a little bit of the heat that's here, a little bit of the self-identity that's here? It's exactly that phase.
Yeah. And sometimes it takes a trauma to induce that, something from the outside, something that breaks down your confidence or your will, so that you submit to that which is completely obvious,
Right.
but is completely resisted before your behavior is compelled to change by some kind of external agent or internal agent independent of your will.
Right. 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 Which for individuals could be an alcoholic crash.
Yeah. Yeah.
It could be a suicidal
Yeah.
crash. It could be, but it could also be an experience of un unavoidable awe. It could be seeing your first UFO. It could be a
Mhm.
psychedelic experience. It could be
Mhm.
actually like seeing a sunrise in a way that you've never seen it before. I think of the two main gateways in terms of a person's individual process as grief and awe. That
Mm.
there's the great humbling of recognizing. I mean, I think there's other gateways as well, but that those are the two great gateways. Um,
You
I
know,
don't feel like,
let me ask you that because I heard a variant of that. What someone said the other day, I was in conversation, the same thing. It's grief, and he said guilt. He says when we come into a realization that we've trespassed against the
mm,
natural law, that we've done violence in some way, we're
yes.
naturally, maybe that's what you mean by grief, but I'd love to have you comment on.
No, it's not, and it's helpful. It's actually helpful because
It's a realization of separation. It's a realization that we've done something to tear the fabric.
yes,
And
yes,
yeah. And then there's awe.
right, right. And no, I would say guilt is a different texture and one that I hadn't
Yeah.
spent as much time with,
Yeah.
frankly.
Yeah.
And I think that's true. It's interesting because as soon as what I have been looking at is as soon as something goes to shame, then there's a counterforce of no, right? It's like guilt is the layer of that social emotion that can bring you back into the circle.
Yeah. Like, for example, just as a personal, when I was a little boy, we were out in Taiwan. My parents were missionaries. I mean, there was a lot of rice paddies and it was very Chinese and so forth. This was in the 1950s and very agrarian. And I was out in a river bed and it was mostly dry, but there were trickles. And I saw a turtle. And I went, oh boy. And I went up and just instinctively grabbed the turtle and he turned around and snapped me and drew a little blood on my finger because he had a real jaw.
Hmm.
And I kind of reacted, picked up a stone and threw it at the turtle and cracked his back.
Mm.
And that was my first feeling of separation.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt guilt, I felt grief, I felt unbelievable remorse.
Mm-hmm.
And I had never felt those feelings again before.
Mm-hmm.
And that experience, Samantha, changed me.
Right,
It really changed me. And in a fundamental way, I became an outsider.
right, right.
So I just love to have you comment on this
Mm.
experience of this little boy who didn't mean anything, but reacted in a negative, fear-based, angry way. And then all of a sudden saw a consequence unintended, but which changed his consciousness forever.
Well, before I comment, I want to hear what you meant about outsider.
It was really kind of strange. I all of a sudden felt alone
Uh-huh,
and I felt a little afraid. I can remember it clearly. I just felt feelings that I had never felt before
uh-huh,
of a negative nature. Uh,
uh-huh.
and I understood, I didn't know it at the time, but I understood Adam and Eve. I wanted to go hide from my nakedness. I had done something that had
Mm,
revealed something about me that I didn't know about myself. And I
uh-huh,
wanted to hide away. I didn't
uh-huh,
want my parents to know. I
uh-huh.
didn't want anybody to know what I had just done.
Oh, well, and the true human would say you just became initiated. In the
Well,
true
that's a
human
comforting
frame,
thought.
rather than becoming an outsider in that moment, in the true human frame, rather than becoming an outsider in that moment, you would have received a very humbling initiation into the cycling of appropriate emotions relative to your empathic connection with life.
Mm, mm, mm. Well, I have apologized to that little turtle 1,000 times.
Yes. And so when you said outsider, I wanted to know what you meant, because in my psychology, which in a way has been my psychology since I was that age, right? In my psychology, that would be a message to apologize, seek reparations and repair and potentially reciprocity, and renew my commitment to care for the turtles.
Mhm, mhm,
And in that sense, there's a simplicity to that, right? Like there isn't a need to hide. There is an appropriate guilt and an appropriate response relative to the relationship that's been ruptured and the injury that's been caused.
mhm, mhm,
Right. And in that, where I thought about that is like, oh, there's an outsiderness then because you've been initiated into something that most people don't know,
mhm,
that's my experience of being an outsider,
mhm.
which
Yeah.
is right. So like there's a way in which, because the recognition, and this is where the Kogi are speaking from and where many indigenous people speak from, there's once you are restored in that appropriate set of emotions in relationship to life and bodies and nature and water, and then you are an outsider relative to modernity,
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
because your structure of feeling is organized in a way that's protective of what the rest of the world doesn't care about, doesn't notice, and is happy to destroy.
Mhm.
Right. So that's the little brother into a normal human initiation relative to how the Kogi see Westerners. So if we went back to that little boy and we said, thank you for feeling those feelings. Those feelings are sacred feelings. They are appropriate feelings. Now, how would you like to take care of the turtle people?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
What would you like to give back to the turtle people?
Mhm.
Right. And then a whole appropriate, in the Hawaiian terms, that might be your amakua, the being, which is not the same word as totem. And amakua means essentially the one you carry, the one you're responsible for. Yeah,
Yeah,
it would be like, wow, you just initiated yourself into a kind of responsibility, and that's great.
yeah,
That's a
yeah.
growing up.
I entered the turtle clan.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So it's interesting because that's what I'm working to do. And it making this presentation, it's so great because I'm still so in finishing this book. It's not done yet.
Mhm,
And like the examples are everywhere. Like this. Like I just love that you shared that story, because like there's an opportunity even now to go back to that little boy and invite you as an adult
mhm.
to like redo the healing loop of that story in a way that is like, oh, well, that's so obvious. And obviously you're living that story. You have already lived that story. And now maybe you get to live it a little bit more deeply. And it's amazing when you're attuned to it, how deep it goes. I just recently
Mhm.
had an experience. Um, so I work with plant medicine. Plant medicine is part of my practice, and one of the foundations of where, and this is part of the book of how to work with plant medicine appropriately, is always with this intention of restoring our enlightenment, of restoring our collaborative membership in the greater circle of life. That's what enlightenment is rather than enlightenment.
Mhm.
And um, you have to work with a larger worldview frame to do that, which, in our current discourse includes a constant intention of decolonization, you could say. And I was recently in an Iboga ceremony, and I was in the second day, which is like kind of a liminal day where you're still very attuned, but also very empty. And this sweet little tiny little blue gnat was spiraling in circles right next to my bed. It was going like this. And very reflexively, I just swatted it and killed it, and it was a little gnat, so they squish really easily. And I immediately felt the loss of its joy. It was like this tiny version of the saddest sound of the planet felt of like how sad a silence could be
Yeah.
when it's the death of a sentient being.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
And
a
it
preemptive
was
mind turtle story.
exactly.
Yes. And you
It's
do it reflexively without thought. And that's where the remorse deepens, that you did something like that without even thinking about
right,
it.
right. Well, you're giving me something to add. Like I need to actually think about guilt and remorse a little bit more deeply because
Well, let me ask you this. I want to talk to you and get your thoughts about love in the following way, because it occurs to me as I've been listening to you, that when we have these experiences where we take ourselves out of alignment, as Gabor Mate, says in many of his books, but most powerfully in his last book on the myth of the normal, trauma then becomes so normalized.
Mhm.
We think not only that it's normal, but that somehow this is the way it's ordained to be. So it's in that state of deprivation, I would say, that I think love becomes so important, because when you fall in love, even if you're in a deprived, separated general existence, you feel the unity that you had at the beginning. And I think that's why people, when they feel love, they will climb any mountain, they will cross any sea, they will do anything for the sake of love. I mean, look at Helen of Troy. For love, people will do anything. And I think it's because it's that feeling of love that's the one thing in our existence that recreates, even if momentarily, the unitive state.
Mhm.
What would you say?
Oh, I hesitate to. To be frank, I have hesitated to use the word love because
Oh,
I think there's many textures of experience that can bring us back to the unitive state. And we sort of owe it to love to explore all those textures in a larger discursive framework.
ooh.
So I've explored awe
Mhm.
and grief, which are both textures of love. Um,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
interestingly, this state of awe in the brain, this is from Dacher Keltner's science, is the same as the psychedelic state, which is a hyperplastic neurological state that allows us to reconfigure very deep architectures of the brain very quickly. Um, so yes, I agree with you. I mean, love, I think the reason I'm hesitating to answer is I watch what's going on in the world right now, and love is so far away from most people's bodies and minds and from the way we engage in discursive processes. So when your question lands in me is, in what context can we experience the kind of love? In what contexts can we experience the kind of love that can restore our connection with life and the unitive state? Absolutely, love restores that. But in what contexts? How can we be the architect of contexts where we can experience love,
Mm, mm,
where
mm,
we can experience safety, where we can experience belonging? One of the frames in True Human is what I call the 7 assumptions, which you could say are reverse engineering textures of love or reverse engineering wholeness. Like not like as Gabor Mate says, recognizing that the assumption that we will continue to live in a trauma-based, disenfranchised, dissociated world is just deciding that's an incorrect assumption is helpful.
yeah.
Recognizing it, though it's normal currently, it is not a necessary norm. And then asking the question, how could we reverse engineer the experience of love flowing between self and self, within self, between ourselves and another person, and in cultures, in group contexts, whether that's democracy writ large or a group where we gather every Thursday or in this space here. And so the frame of the assumptions, the 7 assumptions that are developmentally, that I work with developmentally with people, are first belonging at the root, in the East, the first memory. Second, creativity
Mm,
in the second chakra. These all line on the medicine wheel and they also line with the chakras. Um, Purpose, what I call okayness. And that's actually in the north. It's like the maturity of actually coming into integration of um, being okay, being able to claim innocence, being able to claim
mhm,
the suppleness of rest in oneself, of not needing to prove. Um, Freedom in the sky and the experience of transcendent liberation. This is spiritual freedom that I'm speaking of. And responsibility on the earth as actually like the ground of maturity. It's actually further along in the wheel developmentally in the ground of maturity. All of these are expressions of love.
mm, mhm,
Yeah.
mm,
And resonance is the 7th, which is the ability, the invitation to reside in yourself as your soul. And as Ram Dass said, the soul is love. So if you are in your soul, you are love. That's
mm.
really not even a paraphrase. That's basically what he said. So simple.
Yeah, he was pretty clear.
Um, so the assumptions are you could say it's the work of love, and you can engage them individually in relationship and in cultural contexts.
Mhm,
Um, I've struggled with the word love actually quite mightily in this book and actually don't use it very often.
mhm.
Um,
It's an overused word.
Yeah, and I think we have to be honest that the waves of incredible efforts by a lot of our colleagues to engage cultures of love have failed. And I think it's meaningful that those efforts have failed because why? I think asking why have all the previous cultural movements around peace and love failed?
Mhm,
And I think it's because there's something in us that knows that the word itself doesn't ground us in the how of how do we behave in a way that is post-traumatic, that's real, that doesn't then go into spiritual bypass over and over and over and over and over again. Um, and all of the shadows that we've seen
mhm,
over actually multiple generations now of New Age spirituality in the world. And I think my life has been an initiation in those cycles in a lot of ways. Like I've been in those communities for my entire life, and I've watched the cycles of failure of really excellent and inspiring movements. It's part of why I'm working with Enlightenment, because life is what we're doing. Now, what can we do so that we can tend it with our love?
Yeah.
And that love is an action.
Yeah.
So I tend to be less oriented. I know that the indigenous people around the world are calling for a movement of unity. I tend to be actually somewhat skeptical about a movement of unity because it confronts the need for diversity immediately. And like where I see unity being a really meaningful principle is in the larger context of our belonging to the planetary organism. That's where I think the level of unity is appropriate. That we could agree that we are all one species who is engaging in a human process within the Gaian organism, and that we are one species with that. Whether we all feel that we are one family, like the narrative of one human family is, and this is a lesson from trauma work, when you name something that not everyone feels, you immediately end up with the resistance to it. When so it's like, it's this delicate balance of like, is like unitive consciousness has to include a great deal of space for what is not unified.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Which in our
I'm
world is
interested
most
in
of
that.
it.
Hmm?
Which in our world is most of it.
Right,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah,
right.
yeah.
So that part of reimagining ourselves at the end of our world is placing ourselves in context. The context being a planet that will no longer tolerate us behaving the way we've behaved.
Yeah.
And in that sense, reimagining ourselves in context of a relational, a non-arbitrary relational responsibility, um, that is our collaborative processes with each other and with the rest of ecology, with the rest of the biosphere of Gaia.
Well, I think that's a very important point. I'd like to maybe close our discussion with this last point that you're making, that we're in a world now where the larger ecosystem is no longer tolerant of our misbehaving. I think if you look back over human history, the larger ecosystem has been amazingly tolerant and loving and forgiving. And I think what the Kogi prophecy are now saying, and what we all know to be intuitively true, is that the time of reckoning is now here, that we've overstepped so egregiously that nothing less than a radical transformation will suffice to save us. And within that context, just the final thing I would love to have you comment on is, how do you understand the true human? What does the true human mean to you in the context of the end of world as we know it?
True human is someone who can hear and is singing their part of life's song.
Hmm.
That sounds that is very poetic. It's not it's not a direct answer. It, the way I see human beings is each of us, we have a collective soul purpose, you could say. When you think of purpose, I think of souls as that which makes a thing uniquely itself, and soul is holonic. This is also Rudolf Steiner's version of what souls are. I see them very similarly to him. That there's, each human has a unique soul, and that there's an oversoul of humanity. And the oversoul of humanity has one purpose, which is to co-create beauty, abundance, biodiversity, and continuity for life on this planet. Continuity and emergence, which is those are the twin forces of coherent evolution. That's our purpose. Our purpose is not to grow our economy or to to continue to level ourselves up the pyramid, or to boot up silicon and transcend biological existence, though a lot of people think that is our purpose. None of those things are our purpose. Our purpose collectively is to co-create beauty, abundance, biodiversity for the purpose of the continuity and emergence of life's song, which it turns out, if we organize our time, energy, attention, embodied energies, our economy according to that logic, could actually make us happy.
Beautifully put.
And then individually, we each have a unique purpose within that larger container. And so part of the process is getting quiet enough to entrain with our unique idea, our unique preferences, our unique gifts, our unique proclivities, and like navigate some impossible balance between finding a way to give our unique gifts in response to the calling of the world, and also engaging in that universal purpose in a way that is timely, which relative to this moment may involve writing a letter to Biden.
Good point.
Right? So a true human is someone who is responsive to the calling of life.
Yeah. And responds, as you say, in a way that creates abundance and diversity and fruitfulness, shall we say, so that life can continue to emerge in a more and more plentiful way.
Yeah.
That's our collective responsibility.
That's right.
And then our individual responsibility, as you say, is we all have our own unique role in that vast mythopoetic unfolding.
That's right. And to flesh that out just a little further so people don't feel really lost, there's three essential dimensions of doing that. And one is new systems and stories. New systems, new stories, and stopping actions. This is kind of like the sacred trinity from Joanna Macy.
Yeah.
That
new
there's
systems,
new and ancient
new
systems,
stories, and stopping actions.
New and ancient stories, and new and ancient current stopping actions. You know, or you could also frame that as emergent infrastructures and social structures, storytelling, art, ceremony, and all the things we do to restrain what isn't working.
Yeah. The no's. There's some things that we just need to stop doing.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're shockingly long lists that are very hard to manage, but yeah. And so when you feel lost, you go back to that Holy Trinity and you say, how does that line up with my gifts and also the needs of the world right now? What is for me to do?
Yeah. Beautifully put. Beautifully put. Beautifully put. You know, I think that's one reason why my life here in Washington is so exciting. I'm in an emergent social infrastructure. We're developing a new narrative for humanity. And in light of it, there's a lot of things we got to stop.
Totally. That's right.
And that's why I'm smiling so much. I'm feeling so full because I think Joanna Macy's right. There's a mythopoetic narrative, just simple storytelling. We're storytellers by instinct.
Yes.
We're creators by instinct.
Yes.
And we also need to restrain ourselves,
Right.
which I didn't do as a little boy with that turtle.
That's right.
And so that's an unusually important admonition for me.
Which is part of the lesson of remorse, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Well,
Yeah.
Samantha, this has been amazing. Just give us a final word or blessing or whatever you would like to say to our Humanity Rising community about the true human. This is a beautiful session today. Thank you.
My pleasure. I mean, what I'd love to leave people with is that your attention is a currency in creation. That what we attend to determines what will be. And that the our our consciousness itself it's the currencies through which we co-create the world.
Beautiful.
And
Our
like
attention
to,
is our currency.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the primary currency. And so I've been very much feeling the Kogis asking us to shift how we pay attention to the world right now. And so the thing I want to leave people with is a way of doing that is to recognize things around you as sacred, recognizing that your attention is a currency. I mean, it's interesting because right in this moment, what occurs to me is that even this computer and all the mechanisms that have enabled this conversation, I can offer that blessing specifically to the computer and Zoom and the internet right now as sacred because it's made this conversation possible. Thank you. And that and that we are all able to do that, to
Yeah.
fill the interactions that we engage with a recognition of sacredness, to
Yeah.
texture
Yeah.
attention with that sacredness isn't something that is or isn't. It's something that exists only by virtue of what our recognition.
Yeah. It's bestowed by our
Mhm.
attention.
Yes.
Well, I love it that you're even bestowing blessing on Zoom because most of us take it for granted. And then when it doesn't work, we curse Zoom.
Right.
We react.
For Zoom, it's hard for Zoom.
Why isn't this working? So just pausing to bless is an
Mhm.
act of currency because our attention is refocused in a very simple but dramatic way.
Mhm.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you, Samantha.
Mm.
You're amazing as ever. You're amazing as ever.
Such a delight to connect, and I hope our paths cross more.
Okay, well, I'm sure that'll happen. I'm sure that'll happen. So that'll bring us to a close for today, everyone. That was Samantha Sweetwater. She's going to be joining the after chat, so you'll have further opportunity to speak with her. You can get your link in the chat box. Stan just put it in the chat box, and you received it in your Zoom reminder for the session for today. And then we'll see you all again tomorrow for the story of Roswell,
Mm.
probably the most famous UFO incident in history. We're going to be talking with Donald Schmidt, the great historian of Roswell. Thanks, Samantha. Thanks, everyone. See you tomorrow. Bye for now.
Bye.